graphic to go along with this. So hopefully this is representative of where you guys are right now. So I am going to talk to you about, and this is, I guess, a little bit of a case study of some work that I have been doing with, sorry, I don't know if Siri just activated herself. No, okay. Let me just advance. Okay, so first of all, some disclosures. Indeed, I'm an employee of Sanofi. And a disclaimer, any opinions are mine and not anybody else's. Okay, so this is kind of a collection of work that I've been doing with our group at University of Guelph. So with our students there, Benjamin, Rhiannon, David, Maxwell, and also with Monica, who's the PI of the Network Dynamics and Training Lab group. With the group at York University, John Honmu's group, the Laboratory for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, and also with the Public Health Unit, Kingston, Frontenac, Lennox, and Addington. So Nancy, Adam, and Hugh there. We've also been doing some work on using their data, although I'm not going to talk about that directly. And finally, from Sanofi Canada, my colleagues, Jason and Thomas. So what I'm going to be talking about is influenza. So seasonal influenza, looking at past seasons of seasonal influenza in Ontario, and trying to predict what current or ongoing seasons might look like using what we gleaned from the past. And this is sort of the practical part of this. Of course, when you do work like this, you need data. Sorry, I think I touched my earphone and I activated Siri again, so I shouldn't do that. And in this particular case, we're actually lucky because, well, we're lucky in one sense. Canada has this great data warehouse called RVDSS, so Respiratory Virus Detection and Surveillance System. And here's the address for that. And they have weekly surveillance going all the way back to the 2013-14 season for not just flu, but RSV, rhinovirus, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's really a wealth of data. Now, there is a small complication, which is actually a bit of a barrier to using it, which is if you look here, you're going to see that the data is in the form of sorry, I'm just going to take one of these out. Can you guys still hear me okay? Okay, let me know if my audio goes bad. So if you look at the data, it is all in the form of HTML tables. So if you look at individual reports and it's a document, then you scroll down and there's a table and you open it up and it's an HTML table. So of course, if you're trying to do anything, if you're trying to do any sort of stuff, any kind of data analysis with that, that's not a terribly useful form for it to be in. Now, fortunately, in the York part of the collaboration, there's a guy called Michael Glazer working there, and he is really good with all manner of data science things. Sorry, just trying to see if someone is to access the microphone. No. Okay, so I'm assuming you guys can still hear me okay, right? I'm not sure if those beings...
Yeah, we can hear you okay. We just muted to not to allow distractions.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I wasn't sure if
but we can hear you fine. Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Excellent. Okay, thanks. Okay, so as I was saying, so Michael has done a really, really excellent, and I would say heroic job setting up this web scraping pipeline, which takes these HTML tables and turns them actually into one big friendly usable CSV file. So that's a part of the data that we're using. The other one, actually, Dina Schanzer from PHAC, from Public Health Agency of Canada, although she is retired now, actually did this project with the, I think it's the Canadian Statistics Society, where she did sort of a case study on Google flu trends. So that was a while back. And as part of this, she compiled from the same data source seasons going all the way back to 2003, 2004. So what we're using here is, and this address here, you can go there and it's right there. And it is already in CSV form. So you can just use that and get your hands immediately on earlier seasons of, again, not just flu, but RSV and other things too. Anyway, so I wanted to go a little bit where we get the actual data from, because of course that's really important in what we do here. And this is just the plot of all of this data together. So this is influenza A in black and influenza B in red, positive tests going back to 2003. And you can see, of course, as we know, there's a lot of variability in flu seasons. And of course, there was a wee bit of a pandemic right around here. And then there was a complete absence of flu right around here due to something that we like to call COVID. Okay, so we have this history of past seasons that we can draw on, that we can look at. So what can we do with that? So there are a bunch of different ways that we might think to kind of characterize or compile statistics or describe these past flu seasons. You know, you could look at the total number of cases that occur during a season. You could look at what is the peak weekly incidence. You could look at when does that occur, what week does that occur, what week is the midpoint, which is a little bit different from the peak. That's the point where half of the cases have occurred. Don't practice, it's usually pretty close to the peak week, unless you have a very sort of skewed and asymmetric looking season. You can look at the onset week, and there are different ways to define onset. You can look at the final size. I guess that's the same as what I said up above total cases. You can look at the early exponential growth rate. So of course we know that, you know, to a good approximation and mechanistically what we expect is that in a flu season, being an infectious disease, evolves exponentially, at least initially. And when we start running into you know, depletion of the susceptibles, then of course it turns over and we get our usual peak. But if you look at the early stages of, or the early-ish stages of the season, you can often pick out a, you know, a very exponential looking period of growth. And finally, what we can do is not just to look at statistics on the seasons, but we can try to fit a mechanistic model. Our, you know, favorite, you know, most simple thing that we can do is an SIR compartmental model, for example. And we can try to fit that to the past seasons and try to get a set of parameters that describe a model that fits well. So we're going to touch a little bit on some of these, maybe most of these. Another thing that you can do, and this is just sort of a straight averaging of all the seasons, is to, you know, plot all of them together, line them up by their week, and construct one sort of average season or meta season, however you want to call it. And this is what you get on the left here, all the way from, you know, 2003, 2004 to the current season. And it's a little bit of a mess if you plot it like that. You can plot quantiles of it, and it starts to look a little bit more informative. So we have here the median across all the seasons is the black line, and the darker band is the 50th, is the 50% confidence interval, and the lighter gray one is the 95% confidence interval. So you can see, you can pull kind of an average of seasons. It's quite fuzzy. Now, there's actually a more sophisticated thing that you can do. And there's this really nice paper by Dina Schanzer, Joanne Langley, Trevor Drummer, Cécile Ribaud, and Teresa Tam, going all the way back to 2010. And they talk about this thing called a composite epidemic curve. And this is a more sophisticated version of what I was just talking about. So you take all of these seasons, but instead of just plotting them and lining them up by week, you line them up by their midpoint, which is essentially their peak. It's almost the same thing. So you stack them so that they're lined up by their midpoint. And you take each individual season and normalize it by its final size. So normalize it by, sorry, the total number of cases that occurred. And if you look in the paper, you can get this very surprisingly neat and tidy looking curve, epidemic curve that looks, very much even like what you get out of an idealized compartmental model. And so that is another way that you can describe past flu seasons. And if we do that with the data that we have in hand right here, this is what you get. So going all the way from 2003 to the current, or the season that just finished, you get something that looks like this. So much more tight and SIR, or well, sort of classic epidemic curve looking than this big, more smeared out, messier looking thing that you get if you just line them up by week. And of course, we know that it's always instructive to plot things exponentially when we're dealing with infectious disease. And indeed, you can see you get this, pretty nicely defined period of exponential growth. In other words, a log plot gives you something that looks like a straight, like a linear portion right here before things turn over. So then finally, this brings us to, what do you do if you want to fit a mechanistic model to these past seasons? Again, we're going to assume, just to keep things simple, that we can describe our seasons reasonably well by an SIR model. But then we need to make a couple of assumptions, which turn out not to be terribly influential for practical purposes. We're going to assume, first of all, that the underlying basic reproduction number of flu is 2, which we know from pandemic flu. I mean, we never see the underlying reproduction number of seasonal flu, right? Because we always have some residual or carried over immunity in the population. The population is vaccinated by the time the season gets underway. So we never see the basic reproduction number, except if we look back at pandemic flu and we look at what is the reproduction number, what was the reproduction number there, we get some sense of, what might be a reasonable value. But in any case, we'll pick 2 as our magic number. We'll pick a sort of middle of the road infectious period of 7 days. And we can then, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but we can then back calculate some other important parameters for the SIR model, in particular the initial fraction of susceptibles. So you can think of that as a combination of people who have, rather you can think of the immune. So 1 minus that as the people who have some residual immunity from having either been infected in the previous season or been vaccinated. And of course, that depends on how well matched is the vaccine to the current season's flu strains. How close was the past season for natural infection? How close were the strains in the past season to the current season, and so on? And you can abstract all of that in the initial susceptible fraction. The other important parameter is the observation, the underreporting factor. So of course, we know that surveillance only ever captures a tiny tip of an iceberg of the true number of underlying cases. And if we make an assumption that that factor, that underreporting factor, is roughly constant over the season, which it isn't, but we hope it's reasonably close, then that's another parameter that we can pull out for our mechanistic model. And here are a couple of examples of doing this to individual seasons. This is the 2003 season, the 2017 season, the 2022 season, and you can see this is the best fit model curve that we managed to pull out. And it's far from perfect, and of course there are lots and lots of reasons why an SIR model is an imperfect description, but you do reasonably well. And then getting back to the, okay. So then the question is, what do these parameters look like? What's the distribution? What's the distribution of parameters across all of our seasons? So we get an underreporting factor that's sort of in the neighborhood of 10 to the minus 3 across the seasons. And we get an initial susceptible fraction that's around 3/4 of the population, which, by the way, immediately tells us that flu vaccine is not fantastically good, but we knew that already. It's difficult to match the strains from season to season. Okay, so now that we've looked at different ways of trying to pull statistics, trying to pull information, trying to pull insight out of looking at the past history of flu seasons in a region, in this case Ontario. Having done that now, we can try and use this knowledge for forecasting. In other words, let's look at the season currently underway. Now, of course, we're between seasons right now, but if we did find ourselves in a flu season, or starting this fall, how can we use the sort of information that we've collected out of the past seasons in Ontario to try and make a reasonably informed prediction of what the season is going to play out going forward from any given point. And of course, we don't know how well our forecast is going to do until afterwards. So what we're going to do here is forecast retrospectively, meaning we're going to go back in time, in this case to 2018, to the 2018-19 season. And we know already how that played out. We have the data, but we're going to pretend we don't. We're going to restrict ourselves for our forecasts only to the data up until the point that we're making our retrospective forecasts from. And then we can ask, how well would we have done if we were making that forecast then? Referring back to the three different kind of approaches that we looked at. So first of all, this idea of the average season. This one is really simple, right? We just take our, stacked by week seasons. We get one average season, and we have this completely simplistic prediction that is not influenced at all by what's actually going on currently. It just says our best guess at how this current season is going to play out is just from the average of what happened in the past. And so I think I misspoke before. It's actually the 2016 season that we're using. So at this point, going up to 2016, this is what our average season looked like. And this is only using the season up to 2016. And as we step forward in time, so the vertical dashed line is the point from which we're making our forecast. So the black dots are what we know about, the data that's for the weeks that have already been measured. And the empty circles are the stuff we don't know about yet, because from our perspective, it lies in the future. And so we can march forward in time here and see how well we line up with the forecast. And we don't do terribly badly, because this season was not terribly different from past seasons, although we can see that we overshoot the previous average by some fair amount. Okay, so that's one way to do it. So if we go to the composite season instead, what we do is a little bit more complex than that. So we construct our composite curve, so stack things up, normalize it by the final size. Now we look back at what is our distribution of final sizes for the season's total number of people infected over the past. And we can make draws from that, and typically we make about 30 to 50 of these for this particular exercise. And so we draw from the final size, and then we scale the composite curve up by that amount. And this is where we do actually use what's happened in the season so far. We then we try to shift that curve in time, so forward or backward, until it matches up with what's happened so far. And of course, that also requires some knowledge of whether we reach the peak or not, because that's going to change how we shift things. And so then these 30 or 50 or whatever it may be, different draws of this forecasting method make up probabilistic distribution of forecast. So that's it. So the period of time, again, now making forecasts with this method. And so we get something that looks like this. Again, we're doing better. You can see with the forecasted height of the peak, overshoots a bit there. And we're doing quite well. I mean, we know that this is always easier to get, right? Once you're on the downslope, you're like, okay, well, this is exponential decay, more or less. We don't have to worry about when the peak happened because it's already happened, and that's really the hard thing to figure out. So that's sort of, in a way, that's the less interesting part of the forecasting. But again, we're doing okay here. Here we have more of a tendency to overshoot when, or to be late by a couple of weeks in when the peak actually happens. Okay, and then going on to our third approach, where we fit a mechanistic model. So we use the same sort of idea as for the, as we just used, which is we have distributions now of model parameters, this underreporting factor and the susceptible fraction. Remember that we assumed values for the basic reproduction number and the infectious period. And so we draw from these distributions. And for each one, we construct a solution curve, just the solution of the SIR model. And again, the sort of along with each of them make up our probabilistic forecast. So now we get something that looks like this. So we do pretty well, at least initially. So how do we do? Okay, so this one also does pretty well with the timing of the peak. It's off by about a week, okay, maybe 2 weeks. The height is a little bit higher, but it doesn't do badly. Okay, so we're just eyeballing it at this point to get an idea of how good the forecasts are. Of course, there are quantitative ways of assessing that. You can look at things like the mean absolute error, the mean absolute percent error. If you're dealing with probabilistic forecast, the coverage. So how well does your distribution cover what actually happened? Something fancier called the weighted interval score, and there's a reference here that goes into a lot of these things. It's very, very interesting stuff and very much worth reading in the context of COVID in the US. If we want to sort of maybe more compactly visualize how well does a forecast do, we can use these so-called n-week ahead plots, which looks something like this. So you ask the question, on any given date, what was the forecast n weeks ago? So if this is your 2 week ahead forecast, what's being plotted here is for each week, what was predicted 2 weeks ago. And so as you might expect, when you're looking at a small number of weeks ahead, you do pretty good overall. And I guess maybe it's not so obvious here, but generally as you look more and more weeks ahead, you do less and less well because of course it's harder to predict further into the future. But anyway, long story short, I mean, we really only had time to look at one example of one season, but we can't really draw any conclusions from that, because if we look more broadly and we quantify all of the performances of the different forecasts over different time horizons, the long story short, some do better some of the time and others do better at other times. But there isn't really, at least among the three methods here, there isn't really a clear winner. There isn't one that does better all the time than all of the other ones. So the question is, how do you deal with that? Now, one way to deal with that, that I'm going to talk about here, is the idea of ensemble forecasts. So you don't try to construct one fantastic forecast model that does well in every situation. Rather, you make peace with the fact that some models are going to do well some of the time, but not well other parts of the time. And instead, you try to work with ensembles of these models, and you try to kind of maximize the strengths of the individual models and minimize their weaknesses. And one really cool example of this is the CDC's flu site challenge that they run every flu season. And it's essentially a crowd crowdsourcing, exercising, and forecasting. So any group that wants to can submit model forecasts in, in a pre-specified format. And they used to use percent ILI as the target, percent of influenza-like influenza-like illness surveillance counts. Now they use hospitalizations for laboratory confirmed influenza as the target. And so lots of different groups submit to this. And then what they do, the simple version of what they do is to just construct a ensemble of all of the forecasts, which just takes the median. And then they also have more sophisticated ensembles, which actually look at the performance of each individual forecast over the past so and so many weeks in the season, and then weights the forecasts by their past performance. And now at the end of the season, they look at each of the individual groups, and there's one winner that is declared, one that by the metrics that they use did the best throughout the season or averaged over the season. But the really big kind of public good that comes out of all of this is that you get an ensemble forecast that tends to do better than each of the individual models, as it turns out. So some models do well some of the time against other times they don't do so well, but the ensemble forecast tends to be more consistent. So, using this sort of wisdom of the crowds or crowdsourcing or whatever you want to call it, the CDC, as a side effect of this nice contest that they run, is able to get quite good flu predictions over a 4-week time horizon every season. Now, they also had a counterpart to this called the COVID hub, so something where people would send in their COVID forecasts, which I think is still going and uses very much the same sort of idea. Okay, so that's all well and good, but how are we going to make use of that here? Well, we basically take these 3 different approaches to forecasting, and we make ourselves a mini ensemble, an ensemble of 3. And we're going to do the slightly more sophisticated version where we weight things by their past performance. And so here we use the mean absolute error between what was forecast and what actually happened, that we have so far going into the past. And there are different windows over which we can do that. And we can even use knowledge from previous seasons, although we still need to experiment, more rigorously with what's the value, like how is there value in looking at how different forecast methods did in previous seasons, or, does that just kind of mislead you? But anyway, that's another sort of wrinkle for another time, perhaps. And not only can you look at the forecast performance, but using the same approach as the CDC flu site initiative, you can look at the performance over different time horizons: 1 week ahead, 2 weeks ahead, 3 weeks ahead, and so forth. Because maybe some forecast methods systematically do well over a short time horizon, but they do poorly over a longer time horizon, and there might be other ones that do the opposite. And typically, that does tend to be the case. So we take these forecasts, we weight them accordingly, and we can construct an ensemble forecast. And again, this is the same season. So 2016-17 season starting in a little bit into November and then going just into the new year, a little bit past the peak. And so this is what it looks like. Now I didn't really, there probably would have been a better way to plot this side by side with all of the individual forecasts. I think this is probably going to be an exercise better left for you guys after the fact to look at this. I'm going to share my slides, of course, and you can just look at them and maybe come up with a better way of putting them side by side than I did. But basically, you know, this sort of combines the, you know, some of the features of the strengths of the individual forecasts. This is still a little bit work in progress, so we need to still do some more work on actually quantifying how well the forecasts are doing to answer questions like, you know, how far back do you want to look in time when you're constructing your weights from past performance. I think I'm actually going to finish a little bit ahead of time here. So this is, okay, so this is actually the last slide that I have. This is just to talk a little bit about the project with York University, with John Thommes' group specifically, and also with KFLA Public Health, Kingston, Frontenac, Lennox, and Addington. And we actually have a prototype of a dashboard, which is publicly accessible, up and running. And we actually presented this in a poster back at the CIC, the Canadian Immunization Conference meeting back in April. Now, and the dashboard, like the web scraping that feeds it, is again all constructed by Michael Glazer, who's done a really nice job, as you can quickly see for yourselves if you look at it. There's also a QR code here, which we had on our poster. So you can, if it's quicker than writing down the link, again, I'll share the slides afterwards, but you can maybe just snap a picture of the QR code to take you there. Now, a big caution though, what you see there is more kind of an alpha version, more than even a beta version, more of a sort of a proof of concept, and you'll see that the forecast is a bit all over the place. It's not using, it's using an earlier and less, even less sophisticated version than what I was just talking about now. One thing it does, one additional thing it does that I had alluded to that we haven't talked about here is to also use the KFLA data. So KFLA operates this thing called the ACEs network. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on the acronym. Acute Care Enhanced Surveillance, I think is what it is. And they have, among other things, they have real-time data on emergency room admissions, and they have stratify out emergency room admissions for influenza-like illness. And so what we wanted to do in this dashboard also was to use this data as a target and to be able to forecast these ILI, emergency room admissions. And the way that we do this in the dashboard is we found that if you're using, if you're trying to do forecasting directly from the data, the RVDSS, the surveillance data rather than the hospital surveillance data, tends to work somewhat better. And this is to do with the kind of big, background of that you tend to have to subtract off for ILI and various other things. There are various ways to do it. What we ended up doing for the dashboard is to actually to do the forecasting on the standard surveillance data, and then to have a regression model that takes you from, a regression model that basically gives you a translation from the surveillance data to the ACEs data, and then you use those same regression coefficients on your forecast to try to forecast the ACEs hospital admissions. So you can have a look at it there. Again, we're going to be updating that first of all with better retrospective forecasts, hopefully soon. And we're going to be updating it in real time as this current season gets underway. Okay, so I'll end with that, and I think we have probably a fair bit of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Hi Ed, so we did our muted clapping again, so let's go for a second try.
Thank you very much.
Something to spell down is, were there any questions? Francis? Yeah.
So since we don't have any single, how should I?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Yeah,
If you
totally.
can
And
maybe
I
repeat
feel
that.
like maybe instead of me repeating the questions, which has been my usual thing, but I don't always get it right, maybe like I know Jesse, you can ask the next question. So how about we come up to the front and ask our questions? I think Francis' question was about ensemble forecasts.
Mhm.
And so you have multiple models, and what do you do with the predictions when you have multiple models?
So
Right. Yeah. So I mean the different there are different ways of coming at it. Like I said, the simplest thing to do is to just say, well, just rely purely on the wisdom of the crowds and take the average of everything. So you would take all of the individual models, and then you could just take the median of the forecast, and then of course you can calculate whatever quantiles you want to get, say, a 50% confidence interval and a 95% confidence interval, and you would get a sort of a middle of the road forecast, taking everything into account. Now, the more sophisticated but also more complicated version of that, and that's where you start having all these meta parameters that you need to tune, is to find ways of weighting the individual forecasts by their past performance. Using whatever metric you may have, say mean absolute error, and you can ask, okay, over the past 10 weeks, how well did the forecast by group C do? And okay, they did really well, so we're going to give them a high weight when we compute a weighted average out of the individual forecasts. But then we look at group G and they did terribly, so we're going to give them a really low weight. And of course, those weights, dynamically evolve. And, maybe you look back over some time horizon, and as you go forward in the season, maybe group G starts doing better and better, and they gradually get a higher weight. Does that answer the question?
I don't know. Can I ask a follow up? Maybe Francis has a follow up too. So I know you said about weighting and taking the median. Don't you think that when you average across different models, that you can get forecasts that actually reflect the behavior of neither of the models? If one of the one of the models is predicting a decrease and the other is predicting an increase, and you take the average of that, and the forecast is then constant. Is that in some way misleading? Because actually none of the models said that. One said increase and one said decrease.
No, that's a really good
the
point.
average is not actually the set at all. Yeah.
That's a really good point. And I mean, in the situation that I'm describing, this sort of mini ensemble here that we built ourselves, where you only have 3 models, I think that's a big danger, because you have basically small number statistics. It seems in practice to happen less when you have a bunch of models, but not necessarily. I mean, at the end of the day, the forecast, even with the weighting, tends to be kind of a middle of the road aggregating of everything. So what you're describing can definitely happen, that you have, half the models predict an increase, half the model predict a decrease. And, what comes out is, well, everything's going to stay the same, even when, we know that that's kind of an unphysical result. Now, a little sort of addendum to that, and this is kind of a humiliating thing for forecasters in general. It turns out that if you make the dumbest possible forecast and you predict that the incidence a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, and so on is going to be exactly the same as it is this week, and then you compute your performance over a longer time scale, you actually usually beat all of the other models, which is really a cheat. It's really gaming the whole thing, because you have a model, you're sort of going by the stock being right 2 times a day principle, but you're also, because you're never making any very sort of extreme predictions, you're never really right, but you're never wrong by a huge amount. And I guess maybe to some degree this is more the case for something like COVID, where there wasn't like one discrete peak, but it was just a bunch of turnover points, and we never knew exactly when they were going to happen. But anyway, I guess the short answer is yes. In principle, that can happen. In practice, it tends not to happen so much, because it does require a little bit of a fine tuning that half the models vote one way and half vote the other. It's sort of like getting an election where you have a split vote, or you end up with a minority government or something. But I mean, that's a really good point, and that's one of the things you kind of worry about, and that you kind of try to ameliorate when you're tweaking the meta parameters to do this, to construct this sort of an ensemble.
Did you have? I don't know if we discussed the points you were wanting to make, Francis. I don't know.
I was also thinking about this. I was using my job as a voluntary, as a one teacher in data. I'll end up so important. But already exposed all your data. Yeah, so you would have some to so
Sorry, I'm not getting that either.
Yeah, it was quite complicated, and I don't know if I remember it all. Like there were some points about like fitting different models to like different parts of the data series. Something called data leaking, and what was the last thing?
Yeah, so that's what I'm. So like
Overfitting, yeah.
Overfitting, right. That's another good point. I mean, essentially, if you have all of these ensemble members, you have a lot of different degrees of freedom in fitting things.
Okay, I think we'll.
You have to worry about.
Did you want to,
Sorry.
if someone has a question and they want to come to the front.
Quick question. When you were comparing your models, did you do like for the MAE a train test split, or were you just looking at MAE on the entire data series, or did you do any validation that way?
The students that are working with us at Guelph are actually better than what I was describing, and exactly that. He's been dividing things into.
I guess we're losing the sound a bit on your end, Ed.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
It is better now, yeah. So maybe if you start from the beginning, because we missed most of the answer.
Sure. Okay, so the work that some of our students at Guelph are doing on this, they're actually doing this in a more sophisticated manner than what I was describing, and Benjamin Bentaki in particular has been doing exactly that. He's been taking the past seasons and dividing them into a training, a testing, and a validation data set, part of the data set.
We're losing the sound again. You probably can't hear me say that because we lost the last. Probably can't see. We're losing the sound again.
How is this?
I don't know. I think.
Let me take these out.
Okay. I don't remember where we're up to. So yeah, I think we heard quite a lot of the answer to Jess's question. And were there any more questions? All right. Well, thanks very much, Ed, for giving the talk. It seems like you're in your car or something. So maybe it was like some kind of you're handling some kind of emergency concurrently. So thanks for your time. And it was really interesting to see your forecasting work because that's something that we've been learning about in the summer school. Maybe, can you hear me?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
I guess we haven't been hearing each other. I was sort of just saying thank you for giving the talk, and that we're just having a bit of trouble hearing. So
Okay.
we did manage to hear the presentation and the answers to the questions. So yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us here at the summer school.
Great, and I apologize again for the connection and audio troubles. I didn't realize I was going to be on the road at this time, but that's okay. But so and of course I'll share my slides. You can hopefully get more out of that also. And thanks again very much for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.